Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling said when he saw her reorganizing the crash cart at 0247 hours. Those words, soft enough to sound kind but sharp enough to draw blood. Natalie didn't look up. She never did. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her head, and her hands, scarred hands, steady hands, continued sliding the defibrillator pads into their compartment with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. He didn't know those hands had once held a bleeding Marine's abdomen together while rounds snapped past her head in Marjah. He didn't know anything about her. And that was exactly how she needed it. Oak Creek Memorial in Norfolk smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee, a sharp blend that burns the back of the throat after 8 hours. 18 months Natalie had been walking these corridors at night, the graveyard shift, 1900 to 0700, the skeleton crew when the administrators went home and the real work happened in the dark. The ER at night was different. Quieter in some ways, louder in others. The usual chaos of daytime patient flow replaced by a different kind of emergency, the violent kind, the overdose kind, the kind that couldn't wait because waiting meant death. She'd chosen this shift deliberately. Night shifts meant fewer questions. Fewer eyes. Fewer people who might recognize something in her that didn't match the quiet nurse who moved like a ghost through the linoleum corridors, flinching at ambulance sirens as if they were still incoming rounds. The shadows under her eyes could be blamed on insomnia, on the toll of shift work, on anything except what they really were, the remains of a life lived so intensely that normal life felt like sleepwalking. Her scrubs were the same slate blue as everyone else's. Her badge hung from a lanyard with 1,000 other badges, unremarkable. The only thing that might have caught someone's attention was her hands, the calluses on her palms, the precise way her fingers moved, the muscle memory that made every action look choreographed. But Dr. Sterling didn't notice hands. He noticed the way she jumped when he spoke, the way her voice went soft when he was in the room, the way she made herself smaller. That was what he saw. That was all he chose to see. The shift had been typical until 0304 hours, quiet enough that Natalie had actually refilled the ER coffee pot, the one that tasted like burnt rubber and desperation, the one that kept the night shift awake like an 4-drip of caffeine and regret. She'd been standing at the nurse's station when the intercom crackled, inbound. 37-year-old male, MVA with multiple injuries, ETA for minutes. The words came through static, professional and urgent, the kind of call that meant the next few hours would matter. The kind of call that made her chest tighten in a way she'd spent 18 months trying to avoid. But then the paramedics came through the ER doors, and everything changed. The ambulance bay doors crashed open like a gunshot, that sound, that particular violence of hinges forced too fast, and the night shift's quiet dissolved into controlled chaos. The paramedics rolled a stretcher through, wheels squeaking against the linoleum, their voices clipped and urgent, 37-year-old male, IED blast for years post-injury, presenting with respiratory distress, unable to communicate verbally, no auditory response, patient extremely agitated. The words poured out in the practiced rhythm of people who'd said these things 1,000 times before, every word an arrow pointing at a problem that needed solving. But Natalie wasn't hearing the paramedics anymore. She was looking at the patient. He was trembling. Not the trembling of someone in pain, though clearly the pain was there, his jaw was clenched so tight it could have snapped. This was different. This was the trembling of a body remembering something the mind had learned to live with. His hands shook as he gripped a pair of combat boots to his chest, old boots, worn through at the heels, the leather cracked and faded to the color of old blood. The laces were frayed. One of the boots had a dent in the side, the kind of dent that came from high-velocity impact, from metal and pressure and the specific kind of trauma that left permanent marks. He was trying to sign. His hands moved in rapid, desperate gestures, fingers forming shapes that the young paramedics clearly didn't understand. Respiratory distress, they kept saying, but that wasn't what his hands were saying. His hands were screaming something else entirely. His eyes, one of them slightly clouded, the mark of concussive trauma, were locked on the faces around him, searching for comprehension that wasn't coming. Natalie's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. It was just a moment. Just a fraction of a second where the careful walls she'd built over 18 months cracked enough to let something through. The coffee tasted like burnt rubber and regret. She set the cup down on the edge of the counter with deliberate care, the kind of care that kept things from shattering. The young Marine, and he was a Marine, she could see it in the way his shoulders held tension despite the trembling, in the high and tight haircut barely visible under the blood matted in his dark hair, in the tattoo on his left forearm that said Marjah 2010 to 2012, was being wheeled toward triage. The triage nurse, a girl who couldn't have been more than 24, looked panicked. Does he have family? Can anyone communicate with him? She raised her voice as if volume could bridge the gap that the IED had created for years ago. Sir? Can you tell us where it hurts? His hands moved again, signing more desperately. The boots pressed harder against his chest. That was when Dr. Sterling arrived. He moved through the ER the way he always moved, as if the space rearranged itself to accommodate him, as if his presence had a gravitational pull that made the room smaller. Polished shoes clicking against the linoleum. A lab coat that was somehow still pristine at 0304 hours on a Wednesday morning, as if he'd put it on moments before walking through the door. The kind of man who looked at a room full of suffering and saw an obstacle course to be navigated efficiently. What do we have? His voice was the kind of voice that expected answers, not suggestions. The kind of voice that had never been told no by anyone who mattered. The triage nurse rattled off vitals, respiratory distress, elevated heart rate, multiple lacerations, but communication. Sterling interrupted. He's deaf. IED blast, for years ago. He's trying to sign but English speakers. Sterling was already looking past her, at the young Marine still gripping those boots, still trembling. His gaze moved over the patient the way a surgeon's scalpel moves through tissue, precise, clinical, dismissive. What he saw was a problem without a clean solution. What he saw was a patient who would require time, resources, adaptation. What he saw was something his department didn't have the infrastructure to handle. No one on staff signs, the triage nurse said quietly. We're trying to find someone from communication barriers. Sterling's words came out flat, almost administrative. Resource allocation concerns. We're at 92% capacity. We don't have the personnel for nonverbal intakes. Someone page neurology, see if they can provide translation services. He was already turning away, his attention already moving on to problems that could be solved with standard protocols. Get him stabilized, run a basic workup, and transfer him to general once they have bandwidth. The contempt wasn't loud. That was the thing about contempt from someone with power, it doesn't need to shout. It lives in the small things. In the way his eyes didn't quite focus on the Marine's face. In the way his mouth tightened at the corners, as if the very existence of a deaf patient was a personal inconvenience. In the way he said nonverbal the same way someone might say defective. Natalie watched all of this from the nurse's station, her coffee forgotten, her hands gripping the edge of the counter hard enough to turn her knuckles white. The Marine was still trembling. The boots were still pressed against his chest like a prayer. His eyes, those eyes that had seen something in Marjah that the rest of the world wasn't supposed to understand, were searching the faces around him for someone who recognized what he was trying to say. He was trying to say something about his breathing. Something about pressure. Something that the trembling and the signs were communicating with perfect clarity to anyone who'd ever been trained to listen to a body's language instead of just its words. Natalie had been trained. 18 months ago, that training was supposed to be behind her. But muscle memory is a hard thing to kill. Muscle memory lives in the hands, in the spine, in the specific way a person's nervous system learns to read chaos and find the signal underneath the noise. She picked up her coffee cup again, muscle memory, disguise, the lie of normalcy. But her eyes didn't leave the Marine in triage. His eyes, clouded and desperate, searching for help that the system was already preparing to deny him. The combat boots. The tattoo that said Marjah. The trembling that wasn't fear. The trembling that was something else entirely. The trembling that was a man drowning while standing in a room full of people who decided he wasn't their problem. That was when something shifted behind Natalie's eyes. Something that had been sleeping for 18 months began to wake. The breakfast tray hit the tile floor at 0700 hours. Eggs scattered like shrapnel. Coffee spread across the white ceramic in a dark bloom. Dr. Sterling stood 3 feet from Natalie, his polished wingtips untouched by the debris, his expression a mixture of contempt and something darker, the look of a man testing how far he could push before she broke. "I'll bet you a month's salary you quit within a week, sweetheart," he said, voice smooth as a blade sliding between ribs. "You're not a hero. You're a liability who's going to get this hospital sued." Natalie knelt without hesitation. Her movements were economical, practiced. The kind of smooth that came from 18 months of keeping her head down and her past buried. Her knees didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She collected the broken pieces one by one, stacking them on the remnant of the plate like a ritual. "I heard you spent all night with the deaf Marine," Sterling continued, his voice pitched to carry across the nearly empty cafeteria. 2 residents looked up from their laptops. A nursing assistant pretended not to listen while refilling the coffee station. Learning sign language off YouTube videos. Very touching. Very pointless. She didn't respond. The fork went into the pile. The spoon. She wiped up the coffee with a napkin, her movements deliberate, unhurried. "You know what he is?" Sterling pressed, watching her work. "A resource drain. Liability nightmare. 10 doctors came through that ER last night. Every single one of them saw the same thing I did. Communication barrier. Consent issues. Documented and moved on. That's called triage. That's called protocol." The number hung in the air like smoke. 10. She'd watched them cycle through. 10 doctors, each one glancing at Colt's deaf ears and the gap in his ability to hear verbal instructions, each one noting it in the chart like a diagnosis, each one turning away. Dr. Richardson. Dr. Patel. Dr. Hayes, no relation. Dr. Chen. Dr. Vasquez. Dr. Moorhead. Dr. Lakshmi. Dr. Ortega. Dr. Bennett. And Dr. Sterling himself, leading the procession of refusals like some grim parade. She stood. The broken plate balanced in her palm. She did not make eye contact yet. "He's no one, Natalie. A discharge is a discharge. Monday, the VA clinic can figure him out. That's not our problem." The words were designed to wound. She could feel them like projectiles, meant to confirm what the system had already decided, that Colt didn't matter, that her investment in him was emotional waste, that she should let him float away into the machinery of bureaucratic indifference. She walked to the trash without a word, disposed of the broken pieces, and turned back to look at Sterling directly. 1 breath in. Held. Released. The tears came without warning, a single tear that escaped her left eye and traced a line down her cheek. But her voice, when it came, had the temperature of winter. "Sergeant James Colt was my son Marcus's commanding officer in Helmand Province, Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Marcus came home in a flag-draped box because Sergeant Colt carried him 2 kilometers to the landing zone while bleeding out from an IED blast that took his hearing." She paused, wiping the tear away with the back of her hand but maintaining eye contact. "I'll pick up those charts after I make sure he survives the night you've condemned him to." Sterling's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed in a way that suggested he was calculating something, reassessing the equation he'd been working with. For a moment, the cafeteria seemed to compress around them, the fluorescent lights above making everything clinical and exposed. "Your nursing license depends on chain of command, not sentiment," he said quietly. But there was something different in his voice now. A thread of uncertainty. She'd supposed to crumble. She'd supposed to apologize. She'd supposed to be just a nurse, deferential and breakable. She wasn't. He turned and walked toward the nurse's station without waiting for a response. she followed at a distance, watching him move through the pre-dawn corridors of Oak Creek Memorial like he owned the air itself. When they reached the desk, he pulled her patient charts from the rack, 4 of them, manila folders thick with assessments and notes. In one fluid motion, he swept them off the counter and across the tile floor. "Pick those up, sweetheart. That's actual nursing work. Not babysitting deaf veterans who should be someone else's problem." The charts scattered. Pages spilled across the linoleum in a cascade of medical data and documentation. Several residents and nurses froze. The night shift never directly confronted Sterling. That wasn't how the ecosystem worked. He was too powerful, too connected, too comfortable with weaponizing his position. Natalie took one measured breath. She looked at the charts. She looked at Sterling. And she let it happen, that single tear that had been threatening since Colt pointed to those worn combat boots on his bedside table, boots scarred from Marjah dust and carrying the weight of soldiers' lives. She didn't look away from Sterling as she wiped it. "Sergeant Colt was my son's commanding officer in Helmand," she said again, her voice steady as a pulse monitor reading sinus rhythm. "I'll pick these up after I make sure he survives the night you've condemned him to." What she didn't say, that his dismissal was documentation. That his refusal to treat a patient on the basis of communication barriers was already costing him. That the moment she made that statement, that connection between Colt and Marcus, between Marjah and Norfolk, between a deaf Marine and a dead Marine's mother, she'd shifted something in the hospital's liability calculus. She'd made Colt matter, not as a statistic, but as a life tied to consequences. Sterling's expression hardened. "You're on very thin ice, Natalie." She knelt and gathered the first chart, her hands moving through the familiar geometry of crisis recovery, reach, retrieve, organize. Not hurried. Not frantic. This was control. This was what the system looked like when it functioned properly, when someone with nothing left to lose decided that protocol was less important than keeping a Marine alive. By 0300 hours, she was in the hospital break room, alone except for the buzz of the fluorescent ceiling panels and the glow of her phone screen. Her eyes burned with exhaustion. She'd worked 18 months at Oak Creek Memorial without incident, without revelation, without so much as a raised voice. One night with Colt had unraveled all of that, not because she'd chosen it, but because the moment she recognized that combat boots belonged to Marjah, she recognized that she couldn't walk away. YouTube loaded on her phone. Her fingers trembled as she searched ASL Basics for healthcare professionals. The video started playing. A woman with kind eyes and quick hands demonstrated the alphabet. The numbers. Common medical phrases. Pain. Where does it hurt? Breathe. Heart. Hospital. Natalie watched. Paused. Repeated. Her hands that had held lives together under sniper fire, hands that had muscle memory for field medicine from another lifetime, fumbled with the signs. The muscle memory didn't translate. The competence felt distant. But she kept going. 0330, 0400. 0430, each sign repeated until her hands understood what her mind was learning. The break room was silent except for the sound of her own breathing and the soft American Sign Language videos playing on an 8-year-old iPhone. She was learning a language she might only need for one night with one patient. Learning it anyway. By 0500, she could sign basic questions. Pain. Where? Help. You safe? That last one took longer. The movement wasn't intuitive. Natalie had to watch it 5 times before her hands found the geometry of safety, one hand crossing her chest as if in salute, then both hands opening outward. You safe? The gesture looked like prayer and promise. She saved the videos to her phone. Memorized the signs. At 05 for 5, she deleted her search history, old habit, old paranoia. No one needed to know she was learning ASL in her break room at the start of a double shift that would keep her at Oak Creek Memorial for 24 consecutive hours. Sterling arrived at 0630, moving through the ER with his phone already pressed to his ear. She watched him from across the unit, Watched the way he gestured with his free hand, watched the way his jaw moved as he spoke to someone on the line. He was calling the board. She could tell by his posture. He was escalating. Colt was in Bay 7, alone in a curtained alcove because Sterling had reassigned the other floor nurses. He was awake when she approached, his eyes tracking her movement with the precision of someone who'd learned to read the world through sight alone. He signed something she didn't understand, something fast and frustrated. She smiled. Slow. Deliberate. She spelled out his name in ASL, 3 letters she'd practiced 100 times in the break room. Colt. His eyes widened. She'd never seen a deaf person cry with their whole body before, tears running down his face, his shoulders shaking, his hands making signs she didn't yet understand but could feel the weight of. Relief, maybe. Recognition. The simple acknowledgement that he existed, that his communication mattered, that someone had spent the night learning how to hear him. She sat on the edge of his bed. Took his vital signs. Heart rate elevated. Blood pressure stable. Oxygen saturation normal. She wrote on the whiteboard she'd brought from the break room, "I'm here. You're safe. We'll figure it out." His hands moved again, slower this time, deliberately enunciated through the language of his body. He pointed to the combat boots on the bedside table. The same boots she'd seen him holding when he'd first arrived, the laces worn from Marjah dust. Her breath caught. She recognized the unit insignia stitched into the leather, the same patch her son Marcus had worn on his uniform. Same company. Same deployment. She reached for the boots, her hand suddenly unsteady for the first time since Sterling had slammed her breakfast tray to the floor. Marcus Hayes, she signed, spelling out the letters carefully. Her hands moved through the shapes of her son's name like a prayer. Colt nodded. His eyes closed. More tears. His hands came up and signed something, a full sentence, 2 hands moving in tandem. She couldn't translate it. But she understood the gesture. His hand over his heart. Then reaching toward her. "I know," she said aloud, speaking the words because sometimes meaning transcends language. "I know he was a good man. I know you cared about him." Sterling appeared at the curtain at 0815, his eyes cold and calculating. He glanced at her notes, then at Colt, then at Natalie. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, that she wasn't going to break. That this night wasn't going to end the way he'd planned. "You're reassigned to pediatric," he said, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "3rd floor. Effective immediately." She didn't move. "That's an order. Abandon your post and I'll have your license." She signed to Colt, "I'm here. I won't leave." And in that moment, something shifted behind Sterling's eyes. Calculation. Threat assessment. He pulled out his phone and stepped away from the curtain, and she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd read hostile terrain all her life, that he was making calls. Calling the board. Calling whoever he needed to call to ensure that a night shift nurse who'd learned basic sign language couldn't be used as a symbol against him. At 0730 hours, Natalie pushed through the ER double doors with 2 cups of bitter hospital coffee and a patient chart she'd stolen from the night shift supervisor's desk. Oak Creek Memorial was just waking up, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps, the morning shift arriving in clusters of scrubs and sensible shoes. She'd never left. Not at 0600 when her shift ended. Not at 0700 when the night supervisor asked if she needed anything else. She'd sat in the break room with her eyes closed, listening to the hospital breathe around her, and then walked straight back to find James Colt. Sterling had moved him. Of course Sterling had moved him. The Marine was alone in a curtained bay on the far side of the ER, away from the main nursing station, away from where anyone might see Natalie spending time with him. The isolation was deliberate, a surgical cut designed to keep her focused on the humiliation rather than the patient. The machines around his bed hummed their steady mechanical song, and Colt lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored, his eyes tracking the ceiling as if counting the acoustic tiles was the only thing keeping him sane. Natalie set down the coffee and pulled the curtain closed behind her. She didn't speak. Speaking required his attention, and she could see from 30 feet away that something was wrong. His skin had taken on a waxy grey tone despite the cool room temperature. A thin sheen of sweat beaded his forehead and upper lip. His fingers, which had been signing with cautious optimism just 6 hours earlier, lay inert against the blanket. She moved to the bedside and checked his vitals. The numbers told her a story that made the hair on the back of her neck stand at attention. Blood pressure 94/58 and dropping. Respirations 28, shallow and rapid, like a small animal caught in a box. Heart rate climbing toward 120. O2 sat 91%, slipping with each passing minute. She'd seen this constellation before, not in a textbook, not in a simulation, but in a dusty aid station outside Sanjin Valley with a radioman from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines who'd taken shrapnel in the wrong place at the wrong time. Natalie's hands moved across Colt's chest with the precision of ritual. Palpation first. She pressed gently, feeling the architecture of his ribcage, the placement of his heart. His sternum was a railroad track beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes and listened, not with her ears, but with the deeper sense that came from knowing a body could betray you without warning. Her stethoscope found the muffled heart sounds immediately. Not the clear, distinct lub-dub of normal cardiac function, but something softer, dampened, as if the sound was traveling through cotton. She shifted the diaphragm left, right, anterior. Same muffled quality everywhere. Then she looked at his neck. The jugular veins were distended, standing out against his skin like rope cords, full and rigid with blood that couldn't drain back to his heart. She pressed her hand against the vein just above his collarbone and watched. Normal veins collapsed when you pressed them. Colt's remained engorged, fighting against her touch like they had a will of their own. The classic triad. Muffled heart sounds. Jugular venous distension. Blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well. Cardiac tamponade. Blood was gathering in the pericardial sac, the tough fibrous membrane surrounding his heart, crushing it with every beat like a fist slowly closing around a sparrow. He was dying in millimeters, one lost milliliter of pressure at a time. Beck's triad. That's what they called it in textbooks, named after a man who'd never heard gunfire, never felt the heat of a body losing consciousness beneath his hands. But Natalie had another name for it. She called it the sound of time running out. She paged the on-call physician immediately. Dr. Raymond Chen, an internal medicine attending who'd rotated through emergency medicine last year, spent maybe 3 seconds on the phone before the hesitation in his voice became audible. Communication barriers. He'd need to consult cardiology. He'd need to verify the diagnosis with imaging. He was 28 minutes away from the hospital. Could she start in 4? Could she get a chest X-ray? He'd be there soon. 28 minutes. Colt had maybe 15. She paged Dr. Sterling. The phone rang and rang. Voicemail. She tried the main number and asked for his extension. He'd left at 0430, the night supervisor said. Gone. Unreachable. No callback available. Of course he had. Of course he was gone, his phone probably powered down, his morning already planned in ways that didn't include a deaf Marine and a night shift nurse who dared to learn sign language on her own time. Natalie stood at the bedside and made a choice. Not the choice that made sense. Not the choice that kept her career intact or her record clean. Not the choice that followed protocol or dotted the correct boxes on the incident report. She made the choice that kept James Colt alive. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 100 times under fire. Ultrasound machine from the trauma bay, she knew where it was kept, knew how to unlock it. Sterile pericardiocentesis kit from the supply closet. 18-gauge needle. Syringe. Local anesthetic. Chlorhexidine for the skin. Gloves that snapped against her wrists like gunshots in the silence of the early morning. She'd never done this in a hospital setting. She'd only done this outside Marjah with an IED victim and a prayer that muscle memory was stronger than fear. Her hands didn't shake. That tremor she'd carried for 18 months, the PTSD shake that had made her abandon the Navy, that had made her choose anonymity over honor, it vanished the moment her fingers touched the ultrasound probe. The trembling was replaced by something else entirely. Certainty. Authority. The absolute knowledge that she was the only person between this man and death. She positioned him supine and prepped the skin just below his xiphoid process, angling slightly to the left, moving the ultrasound transducer across his chest to identify the pericardial sac. There it was. The dark fluid collection surrounding his heart, accumulating like an enemy siege, crushing the chambers until they couldn't pump. 200 cc of blood where no blood should be. Maybe more. The heart itself was small and compressed, the walls moving weakly, like a boxer who'd taken too many punches. At 0147, the monitor's alarms began screaming. Ventricular tachycardia. His heart was panicking, firing in rapid chaotic bursts, unable to generate effective contractions. Blood pressure had collapsed to 68/40. O2 sat plummeting, 88, 84, 79. Colt's eyes went wide, his signing frantic and desperate, his hands flying across the air in movements Natalie understood without translation. Help! Pain! Dying! She spoke quietly, and her voice when it came was different, deeper, edged with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Hold still. I'm going to save your life. The needle slid into the pericardial space with a sensation like puncturing the skin of fruit. She aspirated gently and dark blood filled the syringe, 50 cubic centimeters, 100 cubic centimeters, 150 cubic centimeters. Each withdrawal brought oxygen back to his starved heart. His color began returning. The monitor's chaotic rhythm started to organize. 200 cubic centimeters total, drawn from the space that had been crushing him, and suddenly his body remembered how to breathe. Blood pressure climbed to 98. 105, 110/70 by the time she removed the needle and applied pressure with sterile gauze. His oxygen saturation drifted upward, 84, 88, 93. His eyes met hers, and she saw recognition there. Not of her as a person, but of her as the thing that had pulled him back from the edge. At 0220, the ER doors burst open and Dr. Sterling appeared, his face flushed, his movement sharp with the irritation of being called back in early. He was already complaining before he reached the bay. Something about protocol violations. Something about his morning being interrupted. His voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful but not yet in motion. Then he saw the ultrasound images. The empty syringe. Natalie's steady hand removing the catheter. His face went white, then red, then a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was approaching dangerous territory. He stared at the syringes filled with dark blood. At the patient who was breathing normally for the first time since he'd abandoned him. At the night shift nurse who'd just saved the life of a Marine he'd written off as a resource drain. What have you done? Natalie met his eyes with the absolute composure of someone who'd made peace with her choice. I saved his life. The rest is your report. Sterling's hands were shaking when he reached for his phone. Not the tremor of uncertainty, but the vibration of rage being channeled into action. He called the hospital board chairman at home. She could hear him arguing about protocol violations, about unauthorized procedures, about a night shift nurse who'd performed an advanced cardiac intervention without attending supervision. Then he called Natalie's nursing school, demanding complete records, demanding verification of her credentials, his voice building with the urgency of a man watching his narrative collapse in real time. The external medical investigator was contacted next. Then the administrator. By 0400, Natalie was quietly instructed to clock out and wait for further notice. By noon, as day shift arrived and the morning routine took over, security escorted her through the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial with a cardboard box in her arms containing the small accumulated detritus of a career being erased. A cracked mug from a gift exchange. A dying succulent she'd been trying to keep alive through sheer stubbornness. A photograph from Marjah, 18 personnel in formation, 3 of whom hadn't made it home. Nobody said anything as she walked past the nursing station. The day shift nurses watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of confusion and the particular kind of fear that comes when you witness a system protecting itself. What they didn't know was that a Marine sergeant in Bay 7 was breathing normally. That his blood pressure was stable. That he'd just spent the night holding a pair of worn combat boots in his trembling hands and finally found someone who understood what it meant to be invisible. What they didn't know was that James Colt had already pressed the call button and signed for a nurse, any nurse, and when none came, he'd reached for the pad of paper on his bedside table and written down her name, Natalie, in letters so large and urgent that even people who couldn't hear him could understand. What they didn't know was that the real fight was just beginning. At 0200 hours, James Colt's monitor screamed. 3 beeps. Then flat line. The on-call cardiologist, Dr. Reeves, stood at the far end of the trauma bay with his arms crossed, watching. Not moving. Not reaching for a crash cart. Just watching, the way someone watches a problem they've decided isn't theirs to solve. Natalie heard the alarm before she saw the numbers. She was already moving, muscle memory overriding every protocol the hospital had written. Her hands knew what to do. They'd done it before, in a place where the only anesthesia was morphine and the only sterile field was hot desert sand. She was at Colt's bedside in 4 seconds. Vitals tanking. BP 68/42. O2 sat dropping like a stone, 88, 86, 84. His face had gone the color of old concrete, and his eyes were locked on hers. Not scared. Focused. A Marine recognizing another warrior in a fight. His lips moved but no sound came. He was signing, hands moving in urgent, careful shapes even as his body was failing. "Stay with me," she said quietly. Not a request. A command. She grabbed the pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart. Her hands found the 18-gauge needle, the syringe, the 3-way stopcock with the precision of someone who'd done this before under conditions so much worse than these fluorescent lights. The trauma bay had gone quiet except for the ventilator's mechanical breathing and the relentless alarm. Dr. Reeves finally moved, backward, toward the door. "I'm calling Sterling. This is his patient." Natalie didn't acknowledge him. She didn't have time to acknowledge him. She was locating the 5th intercostal space, just lateral to the midclavicular line. Her left hand found the landmarks on Colt's ribs while her right hand prepped the needle with antiseptic. The alcohol evaporated into nothing. She could smell it, the distinctive sharp tang that meant sterile, meant ready, meant go. "Someone get me a 500 cubic centimeters bag of normal saline," she said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the quiet deference of night shift nurse Natalie anymore. This was the voice of Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes emerging like a second skin slipping back on after 18 months of borrowed civility. No one moved. "Now," she said. A resident jumped. Grabbed the saline. Hung it on the stand. The room had compressed into a single point of focus, a Marine who couldn't breathe and a nurse who wasn't going to let that happen. She positioned the needle at the angle between rib and intercostal space, the way her hands had learned in Marjah when the blast had taken out the clinic and casualties were stacked on the flight line waiting for birds that wouldn't come for another hour. The needle slid through skin and fascia and parietal pericardium with a sensation like pushing through wet silk. Then the give. The release. Blood flowed back into the syringe. Dark, old blood that had been strangling Colt's heart for hours while 10 doctors had walked past his stretcher and decided he wasn't their problem. She drew back 200 ccs. 200 milliliters of pressure releasing from around his heart like air escaping from a balloon. The syringe filled. She pulled the needle free and opened the stopcock, letting gravity do the rest. The monitor beeped once. Twice. The rhythm steadied. The flat line became a pulse. O2 sat climbed. 86, 88. 92, 95. Colt's eyes focused. He drew air through the ventilator and his fingers moved again, signing something that needed no translation. He was signing her name. Over and over. Natalie. Natalie! Natalie! You're good, Sergeant, she said. She took his hand for exactly 2 seconds, then released it. You're going to breathe now. The resident who'd hung the saline was staring at her like she'd grown wings. Dr. Reeves had disappeared. The only sound in the trauma bay was the ventilator's steady rhythm and Colt's oxygen monitor climbing into the safe zone. Dr. Sterling arrived 20 minutes later. He didn't knock. He didn't observe. He stood in the doorway of the trauma bay and saw what Natalie had done, a Marine who should have been dead, breathing steadily, his pressure stable, his monitor singing sinus rhythm like a song. Sterling's face hardened like concrete setting. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle flickered beneath his ear. He didn't say a word to Natalie. He turned and walked away. But his phone was already in his hand, and Natalie could hear him in the hallway, his voice dropping into that tone that meant he was making the kind of calls that change things. I need to reach Board Chairman Hartwig. Yes, I understand it's 0220. This is urgent. There's been an unauthorized medical procedure. Yes. By a nurse. I want an investigator here by 0900. I want her credentials audited. I want her personnel file on my desk by sunrise. He called her nursing school next. Then the hospital's legal counsel. Then he called someone else, someone with enough authority that his voice changed, became almost respectful, the way prey animals go quiet when apex predators enter the room. By 0600, there was an external investigator from Richmond walking through Oak Creek Memorial's hallways with a tablet and an expression like someone who'd been hired to find dirt and fully intended to excavate the foundation. By 0800, a senior administrator who'd never worked nights in her life was reviewing incident reports in an office that smelled like coffee and vindication. By noon, security arrived. Not the guard Natalie had helped last month when he'd collapsed with chest pain. Someone else. Someone who didn't know her name and wouldn't make eye contact. Ms. Hayes, you're terminated for cause, effective immediately. Unauthorized medical procedure. Violation of chain of command. Scope of practice violation. Your badge is being deactivated. You need to collect your personal belongings and leave the premises within 30 minutes. He handed her a cardboard box. Inside was a cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent she'd kept alive on the break room windowsill for 18 months, and a photo from Marjah, her unit in desert camouflage, 18 faces smiling at the camera in a moment between patrols. 3 of those faces had circles drawn around them in faded pen. 3 Marines who'd never made it home from that deployment. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She took the box and walked out of Oak Creek Memorial the way she'd walked out of the Navy, without looking back, without explanation, without letting anyone see the part of her that was still bleeding. The rain hit her the moment she stepped into the parking lot. Not a drizzle. Real rain. The kind that hammered against asphalt like artillery, like the world was opening fire on everything fragile. She stood there for a moment, letting it soak through her scrubs, then she walked to the bus stop 3 blocks away. The bus stop bench was soaked. The cardboard box was already starting to soften at the edges. She sat anyway, the box on her lap, and watched cars pass. A minivan. A jeep. A delivery truck. None of them slowed. None of them noticed the woman sitting in the rain holding a collapsing box like it contained everything that mattered. She'd never told anyone. Not her ex-husband during the divorce. Not her son Marcus when he was old enough to ask why she had nightmares. Not the hospital HR department during her intake interview. Not a single person knew that Natalie Hayes, night shift nurse, used to be Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, combat trauma surgeon. That she'd left the Navy because every ambulance siren became incoming fire. Because she'd wake up screaming. Because she couldn't save anyone when she couldn't save herself. The civilian nurse was supposed to be a fresh start. A new identity. A way to help people without carrying the weight of the missions that never ended, the faces that never quite left, the feeling that she'd failed the ones who didn't come home. Now she was unemployed. Now she was sitting in the rain at a bus stop in Norfolk, Virginia, with a cardboard box and a secret that had just cost her everything. And somewhere inside Oak Creek Memorial, James Colt was breathing because of her, and he would never, ever know who she really was. But inside the hospital, in an office on the 3rd floor, something was moving that no one had anticipated. The board liaison, a man named Walsh, a retired Navy SEAL with silver at his temples and a reputation for noticing details other people missed, was reviewing the incident reports when something caught his eye. The patient intake form for James Colt. A note about worn combat boots. Marjah. 2011, a specific operation. Walsh had been in Helmand Province that year. He'd known the field surgeons who worked the forward operating bases. He picked up the phone and made a call to Naval Personnel Command. What he said next would take exactly 3 hours to arrange, and it would change everything Dr. Sterling thought he'd accomplished. 3 hours. That's all it took for the truth to walk through the conference room doors like a weapon nobody saw coming. Marjah Hayes burst through without knocking, his 17-year-old frame moving with the same controlled precision his mother carried in her shoulders. The room, packed with board members, hospital administrators, and Dr. Sterling positioned at the head of the table like he'd already claimed the vacant director's chair, went silent the way rooms do when a teenager in rock dress blues demands attention and actually deserves it. "You need to see these," Marjah said, his voice steady but cracking at the edges. He spilled the contents of a Navy issue presentation box across the mahogany table. Silver caught the fluorescent lights. Bronze caught it again. The medals scattered like dropped coins, each one sliding to rest in front of different board members. A silver star. 2 bronze stars with valor. 3 Navy Commendation medals. Sterling's face drained the color of old hospital tile. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes," Marjah said, and his voice didn't crack this time. It held steady like an anchor. She was the commanding officer of 3rd Battalion Reconnaissance Team in Helmand Province. 23 combat operations. 4 Marines came home because of her. The head nurse, a woman named Beverly Chen who'd worked emergency medicine for 31 years, picked up the citations with trembling hands. She read silently at first, her lips moving, and then she started reading aloud. Her voice grew stronger with each word. Pericardiocentesis performed under sustained sniper fire, Sanjin Valley, March 2011. Prevented cardiac tamponade in 4 Marines during active engagement. Demonstrated extraordinary medical knowledge and composure under fire. Chen looked up from the paper. She performed field medicine under fire. Under fire. The retired SEAL commander on the board, a man named Holloway with a spine that looked like it had been forged in steel and tested in every combat zone that mattered, stepped forward. He moved the way trained killers move, every step accounting for weight distribution, every movement economical and precise. He picked up each medal individually, held it to the light, and his voice rose with each one. Bronze star. Pause. Reaction rippled across the table. Silver star. The room contracted. 2 purple hearts. Someone gasped. And a Navy Commendation. He turned to face Sterling directly, his presence making the air pressure in the room change. 2 bronze stars with valor, a silver star, 3 Navy Commendation medals, and you people escorted her out like a criminal. Like she was a liability. His jaw clenched. "Do you understand what you've done?" The speakerphone on the conference table crackled. A Pentagon liaison's voice cut through, clipped, official, the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. "This is Commander Patricia Walsh, Pentagon Veterans Affairs Liaison. Oak Creek Memorial is under investigation for VA discrimination violations effective immediately." Sergeant James Colt triggered an automated veteran welfare flag when he presented a pair of combat boots to intake staff, boots from the 2011 Marjah operation. Those boots belonged to the unit Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes commanded. "When we pulled her service record, we found a discharged senior officer with multiple combat decorations, PTSD accommodation requests, and a termination notice dated this morning. From your facility. For helping a veteran." The voice paused. Federal investigators are en route. You have 12 hours to preserve all personnel files, all communications regarding Petty Officer Hayes, and all case documentation on Sergeant Colt. Click. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz above, a low mechanical hum that sounded like the death of something. Sterling's hands gripped the table edge. His knuckles went white. He opened his mouth, closed it. Opened it again. No words came. The thing about competent people is they understand consequences, really understand them, before the fear hits. Sterling understood. His contract was finished. His career was finished. The hospital's reputation was finished, and he'd finished it with his own hands. The same security guard who'd handed Natalie Hayes a cardboard box that morning, the one containing a cracked mug, a dying succulent, and a photo of her unit from Marjah, walked back into the room carrying an identical box. He placed it carefully on the conference table in front of Sterling, his expression professionally neutral, the way security guards learn to be when they're delivering bad news in a suit. "I believe you know the way out, sir," the guard said quietly. Sterling stood. The chair scraped backward. He grabbed the box, everything he'd brought to the hospital that morning, everything he'd accumulated during his time in the position he'd thought was secured, and walked toward the door with the gait of a man whose entire institutional power structure had collapsed in the span of 12 minutes. Holloway watched him go, then turned to the board chairman. "You're going to fix this. You're going to find her. You're going to make this right, or I'm going to personally ensure that every VA hospital in the continental United States knows what happened here today." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Meanwhile, Natalie sat in a studio apartment in a different part of Norfolk, holding a cup of tea Marcus had made with the kind of focus teenage boys deploy when they're trying to repair something they think they broke. The apartment smelled like rain, she'd left the windows open despite the damp, and the cardboard box sat on her kitchenette counter like a monument to something ending. "I'm sorry," Marcus said for the third time. "I shouldn't have told them without asking." She pulled him close, and her hands didn't shake. The tremor that had lived in her fingers for years, since the moment she decided to stop being a soldier and become invisible instead, had finally released its grip. "You did exactly right. I should have done this years ago. When I came home. When the nightmare started. Instead, I ran." Her phone rang. The hospital administrator. She let it ring. It rang again. And again. A text arrived, "Senior Chief, we need to talk about making this right." Another call came through, this one from the pension office. Then from someone whose voice she recognized, Commander Walsh, the Pentagon liaison who'd just ended Sterling's career without raising her voice. "Hayes, you can't hide forever. We're coming to Norfolk." She didn't return the calls that night. She sat with Marcus on the fire escape overlooking the rain-soaked street below, watching water drum against the metal railing, and she didn't say anything about what was coming. She didn't need to. The next morning, Walsh arrived at the apartment door with the hospital administrator and a contract that had been prepared with the kind of speed that only the Pentagon could manage. Walsh moved like Holloway had moved, economical, precise, the bearing of someone who'd made decisions that mattered. "Senior Chief, we'd like to offer you the position of Director of Veterans Crisis Services at Oak Creek Memorial. New department. Full autonomy. Full budget. Double your previous salary." Walsh placed the contract on the coffee table. "We want you to build what should have been there all along." Natalie looked at the contract, then at Marcus, then at the photo from Marjah hanging on her wall, her in body armor, Colt before the IED, for Marines who'd made it home because of how she moved under fire. "I want Sergeant Colt on my team," she said. Her voice dropped an octave. "Not a request. A command. And I want full access to review every veteran case that's come through Oak Creek in the past 5 years. 10 doctors refused to treat him. I want to know why. I want to know how many others walked away." Walsh nodded. "Done." And that's when everything shifted. The quiet night shift nurse who'd spent 18 months keeping her head down, her past buried, her rank hidden, she was gone. What emerged was something else entirely. Something that had been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to stop hiding. The truth has a way of moving fast once it starts moving. By the time Sterling's last paycheck cleared, Natalie's new office was being built. By the time he taught his first CPR class to a room of bored teenagers at Norfolk Community College for $18 an hour with no benefits and no future, the Veterans Crisis Unit was already seeing its first patients. Real patients. Veterans who came through Oak Creek's doors and found someone waiting, someone who understood not just the medicine but the weight of what they'd carried home. 6 months later, Natalie stood in her office in dress whites, the silver star and bronze stars on her chest like they'd been waiting their entire career to be worn in public. On the wall behind her desk, those worn combat boots from Marjah, mounted in a shadow box. Beside them, a photograph of her and Sergeant Colt, both in uniform, him standing and saluting with perfect posture. Below that a plaque that read, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." The hospital dedication ceremony filled the entire auditorium. Marcus attended in his rocked dress uniform. Holloway attended in his Marine Corps blues. Commander Walsh attended because what had started as an investigation had become something else, a recognition that sometimes the system fails exactly when it matters most, and sometimes the people we dismiss as insignificant turn out to be precisely where they needed to be. Sterling watched the ceremony on local news from his studio apartment, wearing the polo shirt with the community college logo. The news anchor was interviewing Natalie, asking her about the 10 doctors who'd refused to treat Colt, asking her what she'd say to medical professionals who saw veterans as liabilities. She looked directly at the camera. Her voice was calm, measured, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I'd say that 10 doctors saw communication barriers and liability risks. I saw a Marine who deserved the same chance he gave us in Marjah. The choice we make in that moment defines who we really are." The camera cut to Colt, signing the same words she'd spoken in ASL, his hands moving like they were writing something permanent into the record. If you've ever known someone who carried invisible scars. If you've ever been dismissed because of what you couldn't do instead of what you could. If you've ever wondered what happens when the system finally recognizes it was wrong, hit subscribe. Like this video. Comment below, what would you have done in Sterling's position? And share this with someone who needs to know that sometimes the quietest people in the room are exactly where they need to be.